Your professors are temps. Bear with me as I explain some of the implications of this, both for them and for you. Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach as an instructor at the University of Colorado Boulder. Previous to that, as an instructor on one-year terms at the University of California, Berkeley, 2 of those terms. Previous to that, 3 one-year instructor terms at the University of California, Los Angeles. Previous to that, various one-year teaching assistant things at the University of Wisconsin-Madison while I was a PhD student there. Previous to that, a couple semester-long graduate instructorships at the University of Georgia while I was a master's student there. Previous to that, 1 semester as a teaching assistant at Texas Tech University while I was a graduate student there. So I have some experience over the past, what does that start at? That starts at January 2006. So almost 13 years of life in this business of teaching without tenure at American universities. There's a widely held assumption that all faculty at universities are tenured. The word professor is often associated with the word tenured. And when people hear that I teach at whatever university I'm currently teaching at, so often I get this question like, oh, it must be nice to be tenured, huh? Or, there's some dismissive remark like, well, I don't have tenure. I don't know what it's like to have that kind of cushy job. In fact, I know extremely few people my age or even 10 years older than me, certainly few younger than me, who have tenure. And I think that probably the whole system will cease to exist within the next 10 years or so, although I'm not willing to make more specific predictions than that. What we see, and of course this is well known within academia, but not well known outside of academia or even to students, which has surprised me, is that tenured professorships are expensive. Wow, that's not difficult economics, but yes, it is expensive to pay someone more than $50,000 a year with full benefits and depending on the state you're in, be more or less unable to fire them. In California, tenure basically makes you immortal unless you commit a capital felony. In Colorado, it's a little bit better. And since they are expensive, and because they are protective of the prestige of their position, departments have become much more willing. And of course, this isn't a decision made at the department level exclusively. It's also made very high up at the level of the regions. Have become much more willing to hire temporary and unstable and marginally paid faculty. Typically, the word used for these is adjuncts. At least that is the sort of cover term used when speaking of many universities, although most universities call this something different. At some universities, instructor pretty much means adjunct. At some universities, like the University of Colorado, instructor and adjunct are different things. So I'm an instructor, I'm untenured, but I have a full-time job, I do have benefits, I have a contract of more than a year, whereas I know adjuncts at the University of Colorado who are part-time or don't have benefits or have only one-year contracts, so the instructor position is a little bit better, but it's still untenured. It still falls into this broad category of these untenured jobs that technically within the university context are not called professors. Now this is kind of an interesting question of semantics. When people ask me what I do, and I respond, I teach at whatever university I currently teach at. And they say, oh, maybe it's nice to have tenure or whatever. Well, the next most likely question that I'm probably going to get after I bet it's nice to have tenure is, so you're a professor, right? Because if I just say, well, I teach at a university, there's a shorter answer, which is the one word professor. Because to the general public, a person who teaches at a university is a professor. That's the job description of that title. Just like a police officer is someone who drives around in a police cruiser. Firefighter is someone who fights fires. Accountant is someone who manages accounts. Professor is someone who teaches at a university. But in fact, within the university world, the title of professor is very protected and is given only to people on the tenure track. So you have 3 ranks there. You have assistant professor, then associate professor, then full professor. And then some systems have further delineations within full professor to keep people climbing that ladder. And what's interesting is that within the context of the university, it's rarely the people who have that title professor who teach very much. They teach, but typically it is graduate level classes or smaller upper division classes. The bulk of the teaching, I don't know the exact numbers right now as I'm speaking in late 2018, but I believe it's in the 70-something% range, is done by people that do not have that tenure. It's done by either people like me who work on contracts with the university, or it's done by the graduate students as quote-unquote teaching assistants or graduate instructors. So it's odd that the way the general public actually defines professor doesn't define that title within academia. It defines the people who don't have that title and cannot pretend to that title. I cannot call myself a professor at any university without being savaged by a pack of wolves. That's pretty much the image I would give you. But it's harmless if a student calls me professor, or if somebody from outside the university world calls me professor, because what they're talking about is a job description, not a job title. And as far as they're concerned, it's right. If I deny it to a student and say, "Oh, I'm not a professor," that just sounds like I'm saying I don't know what I'm talking about, rather than I don't have this bizarre feudal title that you don't understand the difference between that and what I do. Now, what is it actually like within this life? I think this is where just about anyone is going to sound pretty pessimistic. And I am probably in the luckier half of people who have had positions like this, because I have taught relatively continuously at universities with 1 year after a surprise job loss. I might talk about that here in a minute, 2014-15, where I wasn't. And I have managed to have benefits in those positions after grad school. So I'm definitely in the luckier half. But, you need to keep in mind that if your career goal is to teach at a university, there are some problems with that career goal. If you actually go on to teach at a university in such a way that teaching is the main thing you are doing and getting paid for, you are not going to have a permanent position. You're going to have a position that, at best, like mine at CU, promises renewal on a 3-year basis or something, unless there's some kind of adverse circumstances, which who knows what those might be. At worst, you're going to be teaching one class each at several different colleges or universities, which might not be particularly close to one another, and you're going to be patching together a living from all those different part-time jobs, none of which are going to give you benefits because you're not full-time at any of those schools. If you are actually after permanent employment at a university or the title professor, then you have the other half of this. You can teach without the money or stability, or you can have the money and stability, but without actually that much teaching. Tenured professors do teach, as I said, but that's not the main thing they're paid for. Their real cachet is in research. And in the natural sciences, that means, often some kind of field work or lab work. But in a humanities field like my own, in language and literature, that research may be pretty difficult to explain to anybody who is not a graduate of the exact same PhD program you are, and who doesn't share a lot of the exact same interests and exact same theoretical underpinnings as you. Now, anybody who's listening to this who is an adjunct or some other kind of untenured faculty at a university or college knows what I'm talking about, I think. So again, this is more for people who are considering that lifestyle or who interact with people in that lifestyle. My own personal experience is unusual. I've definitely tasted both the wine and the vinegar, as I like to say. But on balance, like I said, I do think I'm one of the luckier half or so. I was a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin, where I am not from. It's a weird assumption people make that people all go to in-state schools. Anyway. And in 2011, when I was working on my PhD dissertation, it was my first year as a dissertator, I applied for a teaching job at the University of California, Los Angeles, in Old Norse and related subjects. And for me, I was certainly hopeful about it because I enjoyed teaching, and it's rare to see an ad for teaching in this field. But, I also thought that it might just end up being kind of a practice run, and that would be fine. Well, it so happened that I was hired. And so from fall 2011 to June 2014, I taught at UCLA on one-year contracts. I never knew until the summer whether that contract would be renewed the next year, because my position was dependent on my classification as a sort of replacement for a tenured professor who was on paid leave, and as long as he was on leave the next year, I was going to get rehired. But if he was reclassified as no longer being on leave, which included being on sabbatical, then my position would cease to exist, as it did at the end of the 2013-14 school year, somewhat unexpectedly. So he came back. He was reclassified as not on leave for 2014-15 pretty suddenly in the summer. And this is right after I had gone back to the University of Wisconsin to defend my dissertation there. So I had PhD in hand, but I ended up looking for work just a couple months before my last paycheck was going to come from UCLA. And with a PhD in Scandinavian studies, it can be pretty tough to convince anybody who's not offering a job in Scandinavian studies that you ought to work there. So I went through and I applied to every open position in anything from English to history to German to Latin, whatever that I could find at any college, any university, any high school, all over the United States, a couple in Scandinavia, a couple in the UK, Canada, etc. And as I started to run out of those, and this is after hundreds of them, I started crawling the websites of different counties and big employers all over the Rockies, because I figured, well, if I can't work in my field, I can at least work in my homeland. And I ended up getting a job. The only interview I got out of those 800 applications, by the way, I ended up getting a job at a small local museum in Riverton, Wyoming, where I worked for a year. And during that period, I continued to keep my eyes open when positions of relevance to my background came available. And so for the 2015-16 school year, I was hired at the University of California, Berkeley. This was another one of those one-year instructorship positions, although this time I was not a replacement for anybody. And that was definitely a lot better. And my position was renewed for a second year, 2016 to 17. I think part of my funding, as I recall, part of how they paid for me was I was getting money through the Less Commonly Taught Languages Initiative. So because I taught modern Icelandic, a less commonly taught language, there was some money that came in from an Institute for European Studies or something that helped pay my paycheck. You'd be surprised how many people take languages like Icelandic and Old Norse. When I taught Old Norse at UCLA, I'd get 15 students to start, and same thing teaching modern Icelandic at Berkeley. Same thing teaching modern Norwegian at UCLA. Anyway, and then in the 2016-17 school year, I was still applying for any positions I could find that were sort of relevant to my expertise, because of course I knew that the Berkeley job might continue for a little while, but it wasn't going to last forever. I wanted to find something more permanent, and of course I was not adverse to the idea of getting out of California, which is very expensive, and in which I always felt like a foreigner, as much, if not more than, in some respects, than in Scandinavia. And so I got hired at the University of Colorado Boulder, and a grand coincidence. I mean, the university that offers this stuff that is closer to home than any other university. And so I moved here in August of 2017, and I have been teaching here since then. And this is a 3-year instructor contract, which also includes responsibility for the Nordic program. The Nordic program is a division of the broader Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures. So I'm not a department chair. I am merely the I don't know what to call it. I am the sort of sub commander, I don't know, for this program of people teaching stuff in Nordic at the University of Colorado. And that position is potentially, I am told, very likely renewable, so it is, for all intents and purposes, more or less quote-unquote permanent, at least as permanent as these jobs get, without tenure. But I also know, and I have known at all these institutions, that, I'm not going to get tenure. That's just not something that happens. I mean, it does happen to some people my age. My good friends, I try not to name names in this video. I have a good friend who's a chair of a department, who went to through the same PhD program as I did, and who has a good tenured position at that university. But it's unusual, and it's unlikely, and since all of my positions as adjunct or instructor have been teaching based, without any sort of research component, there's no particular tangible reward for me to pursue, some obscure research agenda, except to try to court some kind of tenured position. But tenured positions are so rare that it seems sort of useless to pursue that much of an obscure research agenda, especially when tenure basically just guarantees you lifetime employment doing more of said obscure research agenda. And I am, at heart, more of a teacher, and also someone not from a family background in academia, someone who comes from, and I don't mean anything bad by this, but someone who comes from a family and culture that is deeply skeptical of higher education and its culture. I'm someone who also wants to act as a bridge, who wants to reach my people, right? And there's nothing about that tenured life cloistered in the ivory tower researching whatever vague semantic thing that lets me do that. And in fact, it takes away time from me doing that. So maybe that's a hidden blessing to this, although certainly the precariousness of these positions is neither a blessing nor particularly well hidden. Now, I've shared some of my story, and I hope that this is perceived not as some kind of a sob fest or attempted sob fest for me. Yes, it isn't. I'll say for the third time, I think I'm in the luckier half of people in untenured positions at American universities. I also don't say it as a attempt at offering a solution, unfortunately. I have had to pursue my own solution. I began making videos on my YouTube channel in 2016. I realized how much interest there was in the public in this information that in my field of expertise, which is Norse language and myth. But I realized that the information that was available to the public was of low quality and often very outdated, and often both proposed and promulgated by people who had agendas, and often very ungrounded agendas. And so I thought, after a brief stint doing a very bad job as a historical reenactor at a park, I thought I need to find a job that's, not going to put me through ridiculous hours, that maybe can take off from my actual expertise. And so I began making these videos and started a Patreon. And now I am happy and shocked to say I make more money from Patreon every month than from CU. I definitely made a ton less money at Berkeley, which is amazing considering how expensive it is to live there. So again, I don't have solutions except on a personal level. Good luck to those of you on this career path, and to those of you who just interact with people on this career path. I hope this has given some understanding of some of the challenges inherent to it, and I would also just like to say thank you to all of the instructional faculty, tenured or not, who treat their students and their colleagues like human beings, who don't plagiarize the work of people they perceive as quote-unquote under them, whether untenured faculty or grad students, and who are working to advance their fields and to assist students and the broader public in understanding everything there is to learn about this fascinating universe that we live in. For now, from my beloved, beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.